So, hello everyone. I'm Nicholas Privelakis. I'm co-chair of the European Union seminar at the Center for European Studies and also teach political sociology and philosophy at Social Studies. Many thanks to the Center for European Studies and to Elaine for making this event possible. It is a great honor to be welcoming Minister Kyriakos Pierrakakis. It's also a great honor to have with us Elizabeth Linos, who is going to chair and organize this conversation. So I'm going to introduce Elizabeth to you, and then Elizabeth, I'll give you the floor to do the rest, right? Dr. Elizabeth Linos, who came back to the Kennedy School recently after being here. When was it the last time that you were here before? 2013, right? As the Emma Bloomberg Associate Professor for Public Policy and Management, and also Faculty Director of the People Lab. Elizabeth works on improving government and has published extensively, especially in questions of nudging, but not only. She is trying to use evidence from public management to consider how to recruit, retain, and support the government workforce, how to reduce administrative burdens that low-income households face. And she has published in all sorts of journals. I'm not going to mention them all. I'm just going to mention a few of her recent publications. Can nudges increase take-up of the EITC? And what was the other one that I was looking at recently? Burnout, right? Predictions of burnout and fatigue in government. So I couldn't imagine a better person to lead this discussion. And without further ado, Elizabeth, I'll give you the floor to introduce the minister and organize the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nicola. It's so wonderful to be here today, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Minister Pierrakakis. I'm going to keep my remarks very short because I know we all want to hear what he has to say about the immense reforms that are happening in Greece under his leadership. But I did want to just say a few words that struck me as I was looking back at the minister's career. It seems if you look at his career up until this point, it really does seem to bring together what we at the Kennedy School think of as kind of the dream links between research and science and innovation and public policy. And so if we start with the minister's education, he has a bachelor's in computer science from Athens University. He has not one but two degrees from universities in this town, a Master's of Science and Technology and Policy at MIT, and of course the more important degree, Master's of Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. And then if you follow his political career, you'll see the same patterns or the same thread, bringing innovation and research and science into the world of policy. So I won't highlight everything on his resume, but I do want to note that he has been in positions of political leadership during multiple existentially large global crises for our country, and has navigated public sector reform that was both necessary to kind of reimagine how we do government in Greece during very different crises. So if we look at 2009, when he was advisor to Anna Diamantopoulou, during the New Democracy and PASOK coalition government, where he was a member of the negotiation delegation with the Troika, and of course, most recently, during our current ongoing COVID pandemic and global financial crisis, where he has been leading digital transformation in Greece, which I'm hoping he will tell us a lot about. So we are so excited to have him tell us more about how he has done this work and lessons learned from that work. I will give the floor to the minister in a second, but as he's talking, please do prepare your questions because we will have time for Q&A after his remarks. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Minister Pierrakakis.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you so much, everyone. It's a great honor to be here accepting the invitation of CES. And I would like to start by acknowledging the presence of two people who were very instrumental for me during my student years here, and later, Elaine Papoulias and Nick Mitropoulos. Needless to say, as I'm about to speak about this journey of digital transformation, which is much more than a journey of digital transformation. Effectively, it's a strategy of national rejuvenation with regards to a bureaucracy or a state that was, I would say up until recently, even considered to be a quasi-failed state with regards to how we're delivering reforms during the memoranda and during the years of IMF bailouts. as I was listening to Nicholas Prevelakis before when you were describing Elizabeth's research on fatigue and burnout of public officials, and he said there is no better person here, I was ready to say, is he talking about me? With regards to burnout. But effectively, we have been a team that has tried a lot in the last 3.5 years to fulfill the vision of our Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, on transforming the bureaucracy, or as digital experts from our team say, or even here, actually in the morning when we were having a class, say, hacking the bureaucracy, meaning how we can change the processes of our government, how we can change the processes of the state, how can we bring future into the present much faster than what we would have otherwise done, and how can we overcome obstacles not only existing, but anticipated. Now, having said this strategy of digital transformation was not purely a technical exercise. It's not even a technological exercise per se, it's an organizational innovation. It's an innovation with regards to how to set key performance indicators, KPIs, to solve specific problems, define the problems, reverse engineer them, and devise the best organizational design that we could, with the best organizational output that we can with regards to the creation of a new entity that would solve those problems. And that was for us what we call in Greece the Ministry of Digital Governance, which became a catalyst for an overall change of our systems with regards to how we have designed our government and our state. Now, it took us a bit more than a year before our last national election to devise this plan. It was, I would say, a very great coincidence that Prime Minister Mitsotakis, then leader of the opposition, had previously served as Minister of Administrative Reform. And as he was telling to his associates previously, he had e-government as part of his portfolio, but he had it in name only. And he felt that effectively he needed to deliver a big change. And the change was also symbolic. The Prime Minister, when he was sworn in, effectively decided to abolish the ministry that he previously ran, and which rendered him the leader of the opposition, in order to create a new organization that would solve for problems pre-existing. And by those problems, I'm referring to the perennial levels and the significant levels of bureaucracy, the administrative burdens that we have been facing in Greece for decades. Many studies manifest that. Administrative burden studies of the OECD showed previously that we had the highest administrative burdens amongst all member states of the OECD. I remember a number from a 2006 study being 6.8% of GDP. So we figured that we needed a rejuvenation strategy. I had the huge honor of meeting Governor Michael Dukakis a couple of days ago, and I remember his last interview when he came to Greece. It was 2016. We were still in the period of the bailouts and the memoranda, where we felt that we were in a political/institutional trap, and Governor Dukakis said that you need effectively to own your reforms. You cannot just have those reforms imposed. You need them metabolized, essentially. You need to believe in what you're doing, and you need to have national ownership of reforms. Thus, you need a national plan of reforming your government and your state. And this was something which we sought for years, but we hadn't managed to achieve because there was no grand vision of things previously vis-a-vis what we wanted to achieve in terms of our government, in terms of a Greek plan for growth rather than an IMF plan, which we didn't, for certain segments of that plan, believe in. This digital strategy that we devised and conceived of since 2018 is fully owned by us. It's a plan created by Greeks with international help, with the help of Estonians, citizens of the United Kingdom, French, Italians, Argentinians, people from all over the world actually helped us, giving us advice at the beginning. And as we were seeking for advice and for good case studies, we realized that those are case studies that we can be inspired by, but we cannot simply copy-paste them. Reforms are like transplants in nature. You need to have donor-receiver compatibility. And contextual parameters define the reforms. So Estonia, being the best case study that one can examine, is also the most difficult case study to mimic. Because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Estonia was designed, the Estonians designed their state, their government from scratch, and they designed it properly. We figured that for the Greek case, we needed a case study which is more relevant for us. So we figured that the United Kingdom and the creation of the government digital service in the United Kingdom in 2011 was the most interesting case study. So we brought advice, but we also located talent in the Greek public sector. And we did both things simultaneously. We looked at both the horizon, the international horizon, and the domestic landscape, and both the successes and the failures. Because learning from your failures is the most productive way of learning. Perhaps learning from the mistakes of others is the smartest way of learning, but learning from your own mistakes, I guess, is the most productive of all. So we had made our fair share of mistakes in the past. And what we decided to do was to change the way our government, our state, is designing processes and services. Let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. So if we think of how the state is designed, we will realize that the state is not designed at all. It's an outcome, but it's not an outcome of rational design at the center. And one can attest that if one looks at the steps each one of our life events entails when we're interacting with our government, be it the renewal of a driver's license or declaration of taxes or any major event of our lives where we need to interact with the public service. In a very bureaucratic country like Greece, circa 2019, one would see that an average life event would entail 6, 7, 8, sometimes more than 10 steps. Those steps are physical visits to public services. So if you have a government that's asking you to physically visit 20 different public services on a given life event, basically you have the feeling that your government is not respecting you. That's it. And especially if certain amongst these life events are more delicate in nature, more sensitive in nature, then this feeling becomes even more acute. So what we decided to do was to use simple digital technologies and make changes both on the books of law and on the screens of code. Now, this might sound obvious, self-evident as a performance indicator. I can guarantee you that it's extremely difficult to implement. Ideas are nice, but 99% of the work is their implementation. So what we decided to do was to endow this new ministry with specific capabilities and with specific powers. The core power amongst them was the fact that we could unilaterally interoperate datasets, all actually the datasets of the Greek state. Now this sounds very technical, but let's take a very easy example, the birth of a child. The bureaucracy behind the declaration of a birth of a child in Greece involved 5 physical visits to public services until February 2020. We're very happy when this happens, so you don't necessarily notice it, but parents have to visit different public services up until February 2020. So we figured that for symbolic purposes, it was quite interesting to start from this specific life event as well. So what happened is that now, 3 years later, all children in Greece are declared, as we say, legally. They enroll in the state datasets from the hospital. Parents make the original declaration at the hospital. They receive one SMS notifying them what the social security number of the child is, a second SMS or email notifying them whether or not they will be receiving a specific stipend. This philosophy, we figured, is the philosophy that we want to adopt for all life events, for all events of life. We're thus redesigning the way government works using simple digital technologies and having obtained the remit to unilaterally change those processes through this new Ministry of Digital Governance. Because in the previous equilibrium, we needed to have the green light, we needed to have signatures at all levels of government. But the problem is that in an event of our lives, when we interact with our government, the event is not structured in accordance with the way the government is structured. Thus, it cannot properly correspond to the priorities of the Ministry of Transport or the priorities of the Ministry of Digital Governance or of the municipality of Sparta. You need to have those events redesigned from the lens of the citizen to make them citizen-centric. That's basically giving power back to the public. And this is basically what we have been trying to do since 2019. The numbers since then speak for themselves. Actually, the first thing that we tried to do was to place a number on the following question. And sometimes the most easy questions, the most obvious questions are the most difficult to answer. And the first question was, hello, how many digital services do we offer as a government? Now, it might sound too obvious, but most governments in the world don't know how to answer this question because the various digital services are buried underneath the various governmental websites. So we answered that question 9 months after originally asking it, and we found out that we had 501 pre-existing government services. What we figured then was, okay, let's start offering those services not through 1,000 governmental websites. Let's start offering them through one single portal. And this is when gov.gr was created. Gov.gr is the biggest of all digital reforms because it's the most obvious of all digital reforms. You need to have a single source of truth, a single point of reference. So we answered that question, and since then, we started by 501 digital services, and now we have 1,520 digital services. And this times 3 of digital services in 3 years has produced a times 100 effect, an almost times 100 effect. Because if we look at digital transactions, i.e. physical visits not made, that number in 2018 was 8.8 million, that's before we assumed office. Then it became 34 million, then 94 million, then 567 million, and as of last year, 778 million. And we calculated digital taxation transactions for the first time, and if you add that number up, it's 1.2 billion. So those are 1.2 billion physical visits not made for a country the size of 10.4 million people, a bit bigger than Massachusetts. And one can see the significant effect that this has made in the daily lives of citizens and corporations, metaphorically speaking, exactly because the previous equilibrium was really, really bad. And there are certain things which were easy to deliver and were delivered and made within hours, not even within days, not even within weeks. But there was at this point an organization and a team that had the remit and the responsibility to deliver that change. Now, the philosophy of that team is more or less obvious as a manifestation of what I just described. Less is more. We need to simplify all life events, all processes. I mentioned the declaration after the birth of a child. There are still, of course, many things that we haven't yet managed to solve for. We're doing that on a daily basis. Buying and selling real estate in Greece is something which has been a challenge. According to the World Bank, we have one of the most bureaucratic processes when you're trying to buy and sell property. We will start solving this on Monday because we're announcing a new digital system, even though we're in pre-electoral mode, as you might know in Greece right now. We haven't stopped delivering services. We believe that this is actually the best policy advice that I've ever received, and best political advice is that strategy is delivery. So we're delivering services, and we will be delivering services to the last day. And finally, acceleration. I mentioned less is more as a philosophy, but acceleration is also a philosophy. I have to say, and since this visit to Harvard is very personal for me, I have an issue with time. I tend to be extremely impatient, and I hope that my advisors and my colleagues still like me despite that, feeling of wanting to deliver things very quickly. But this philosophy of acceleration is something that is obvious in the work that we have done. Now, this is not necessarily always something that we should be doing. I remember the quote of François Mitterrand, donner du temps au temps, that sometimes you need to give time to time. You need to have a sense of making time, of thinking of issues in a deliberative manner, analytically. But I think that every Greek would say and suggest that Greece has reflected enough, especially after thousands of years of reflecting, but even more obviously, even more self-evidently, in the last years of crisis, other European countries required one bailout, one memorandum to regain their equilibrium and their stability. We required 3. And we have had perennial political issues domestically where effectively we ourselves created issues that we further needed to resolve in the process. After 2019, the crises are exogenous, they're not endogenous. We're not creating them, we're solving for exogenous issues. And more than that, we have managed to produce domestically owned reforms like the one that I have been describing in this speech, in this short talk. Now, I mentioned gov.gr. I will mention 2 more bullet points and then we will go straight to the discussion. The second policy reform, which will be a priority should we be re-elected after our next national election, is answering a second obvious question. You have digitized 1,520 services. Out of how many? No government in the world knows the answer to this question. I was very happy to find out that the city of Boston knows the answer to this question. It's the first public official that I asked this question, so congratulations. The first public official that I asked this question internationally and knew the reply was you. So I'm delighted that this is the case. We're attempting to answer that question in Greece. No national government knows the answer to this question. So in our case, we have mapped 5,500 plus services that we offer. And this public platform which we have created is the denominator, let's say, of the number of services that we're offering digitally. So what we're currently doing is that we're systematically mapping all the ways we serve citizens and corporations in Greece. And it's very interesting that it's the previously most bureaucratic country in the world, in the OECD, not in the world, that's doing that, because it's a leapfrog story. Second, this approach and this strategy is not about technology. It's about interdisciplinary teams. It's about introducing technology to the social policy equation. Because on average, when we're designing and thinking of policy, as we learned it at the Kennedy School and in other places, we typically have public policy experts in the room, we have economists in the room, we have legal experts in the room, people who know politics. We don't typically have engineers in the room. Or not necessarily coders, I would say public interest technologists is the terminology that I would use. People who understand technology and how technology can help solve for a problem. We typically lack the culture of integrating those people in interdisciplinary teams. And I think that the significant reform and the significant change of culture that this government has produced in Greece is the fact that we have integrated that philosophy in public policy design on a national basis. The vaccination story and the way we developed a vaccination system which was fully digital, A to Z from the first day, is the biggest of all manifestations of this statement. Exactly because we decided that vaccination wouldn't be only about the vaccines. It would be about a signal to citizens about how we envision the role of the state moving forward as an enabler and the catalyst of all services. And this is why the system was digital A to Z, and this is why Greek citizens had full predictability with regards to when and where they would be vaccinated on the basis of their age, the location where they lived, and their medical condition. Because we had a system which we could reverse engineer, the e-prescription system, which enabled us to be able to prioritize citizens on the basis of their condition for vaccination. And when they went to the vaccination centers, they didn't face long lines of other citizens waiting. Everything was completed within half an hour, apart from knowing when and where they're being vaccinated. And finally, there was this very simple, I would say, very simple picture, this very simple experience that citizens had in the vaccination centers, which they typically shared with us, telling us that they were really proud of their country when they were receiving their first jab of the vaccine, and they automatically had a message on their mobile phones telling them when the second appointment is taking place. And this happening within seconds of them having received the jab. Technologically, this is 20 years old and more. Technologically, this is easy, extremely easy. But systems design, organizational design, and at the end of the day, state respect towards the citizen, this is new, especially for Greeks. And we were receiving this message from citizens that they're really proud of what had happened. And this wasn't something which was very costly. It was something which we had to devise on on a white sheet of paper. And this is why, of course, the vaccination story, despite being the most difficult logistics exercise post-World War II, happened to be an easier exercise than the others that we're trying to solve, where we have old legacy systems that we're trying to both reform and have them continue working at the same time. This is a more difficult feat, but it's a feat that all governments in the world will need to do, conduct, and complete. Finally, let me conclude by saying that, as I mentioned, this is not a technology policy exercise per se. It has many elements of public policy that are interesting for both public policy scholars and for those interested in politics and the policy world overall. It has organizational elements, legal elements, economic elements of policy. But most importantly, the way this is viewed and experienced within Greece is that a domestically owned reform has happened, is happening, will continue happening. We're describing it in proper terms, and we plan to continue it. And this is something that we're really proud of, and we're really keen to continue in the coming years. Thank you so much again for this invitation, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
I have to say, as a public management scholar and behavioral scientist, this is just music to my ears. So I'm so thrilled to have you here to start this conversation. I'll invite you all to start thinking about your questions, but let me start off our conversation with just a few things that I want to highlight from your remarks and some questions of my own. I reserve the right to ask more questions afterwards. There are kind of three main points that the minister talked about that I do want to highlight. And the first is this idea that the types of reforms that were necessary here are not technological problems or problems of bringing in new technologies, but really the fundamental question is one of implementation and one of redesigning how we think about the system. And as a kind of a second main point that I take away from your remarks, Minister, is how you discuss the outcome. So when we talk about what success looks like, or when we talk about what the positive outcome is, you spoke about saving people's time and focusing on the customer experience when they are going through both joy and potentially grief, various forms of grief if you're trying to get through a government bureaucracy. But that really suggests a very different way of thinking about the relationship between the government and the citizen, where the citizen's dignity is at the center and the citizen's time is respected. And then the third point that I'll keep with me from your remarks is the way you thought about integrating a domestically designed new systems reform that drew lessons from the rest of the world. I want to highlight for those of you who may not know the landscape, the types of reforms that the minister is talking about are reforms that the entire world is struggling with. If it was a technology solution, the US would have solved it. But just, as we speak, the Biden administration is working on exactly these questions with their own presidential management agenda. Every city in the US is working on exactly these issues. Boston is a pioneer in this space, but these types of questions are ones where we have a lot of international innovation labs happening by default, but thinking about what that means in a domestic experience is something that we haven't seen as much. So I'm really excited about that. So with that in mind, I'll start us off with questions, but feel free to share. My first question is really thinking about what this means for the long-term relationship between the government and Greek citizens. So that trust in government is low, it's low globally. And what we know from the research is that trust in government is affected by how people experience interacting with the state, which of course has changed dramatically. But it also impacts who enters government. So who are the kinds of people who will enter the public sector and who will enter politics? So I would love to hear from you about how you think this digital leap is going to affect both of those things in the future.
First of all, thank you so much for both for the original comments that you made, which are spot on. This is exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted to change the way services are delivered. We wanted to put citizens at the core of the proposition. And this concept is not necessarily new. I mean, if you read Michael Dertouzos' work, if one reads Michael Dertouzos' work, I remember when I was a student at the bachelor's level in Athens, a professor of mine gave me, in 2001, I was 18, Michael Dertouzos' book. Actually, this is, everyone has a moment, a light bulb moment. This was my moment when I decided to study computer science. Dertouzos' suggestion, who was the director of computer science department at MIT of Greek descent, the suggestion was that IT should be human-centric, as he said with the terminology back then. And engineers typically have a culture of results, and policy experts and policy scholars do not interact with the engineering thinking, so that those two worlds don't, interact with each other. So we wanted to bridge that gap. We drew lessons from the rest of the world. You're absolutely right that it's not about technology, because had it been about technology, then the US government would have had the best technology policy / digital government provision services at the federal level, but this is not the case. This is not the case in Japan, which I visited a couple of weeks ago with the Prime Minister. This is not the case in Germany, within the European Union. Vaccination, actually, both the US and Germany are federal systems, which I think plays a role in the difficulty of adopting, the technological solutions that Silicon Valley, for instance, produces here. Now, going straight to your question, the difficulty of our analysis, I said before that I'm impatient. We knew that there is a Tetris. You remember the game of Tetris? There is a Tetris element in politics. And the Tetris has a philosophy, if you played it, especially those of you who played it younger. And the philosophy of Tetris is that successes evaporate and mistakes accumulate.
Blew my mind.
This philosophy stands in politics. You will be remembered for your last failure. So we knew that as we're creating this edifice of digital public services, if service 1527 is problematic, this is what you're remembered for. So, to remember another game, this is the Jenga game. You build the edifice and you remove the wrong brick and the whole thing collapses. So trust is difficult to create and it's easy to lose. Mm-hmm. And you know research much better than me, but the World Values Survey suggests that the Scandinavian countries have trust levels in the areas of answering. Remember this question: are other people trustworthy in general? Sweden, I think 70%, yep. Or Norway. The last number for Greece was 8.8% yep. In 2016, something like that, 17. We had done this in my previous capacity. We had implemented the World Values Survey. That's why I remember it. So my feeling is that this digital strategy is enhancing trust because digital, by definition, increases transparency. Mm-hmm. Digital is a social policy in the way in which we deployed it because it helps the working parent, it helps people with disabilities, it empowers people who live abroad, and many Greeks live abroad. And obviously, it's better for the taxpayer because the taxpayer realizes that funds are channeled in the best manner possible. Have we measured the effect? No. But I think that this is a great research opportunity for many people in this room to actually measure whether or not this policy has produced a net positive impact for the stock of trust or the level of social capital, as one would describe in Greece. My expectation is that it has.
Okay. Great. Let me open up the floor before I ask you more questions. Any questions for the minister?
Please. Is there a mic, or do you want me to just?
The mics are in the ceiling. They're in the ceiling.
They're in the
very
ceiling.
fancy
Okay,
here.
so someone is listening. Yeah. Hi, thank you, Minister. My name is Ida Schulman, and I'm from the Scandinavian countries, or the Nordic country of Finland. I'm a mid-career student at the Kennedy School, but I have to confess that this is not the first time I hear you speak, because I work for AWS. And I heard you speak in Athens a year ago about the reforms that your government has done. And I guess with viewing the development of Europe and the security landscape in the world, I wanted to hear how your work has been impacted by Ukraine, by the impact, the added focus on national security and preparedness. And I'd also be interested to hear if it's impacted citizens' trust and questions in the security of the services in Greece. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much in your previous capacity as AWS for investing in Greece, because we received significant investment for all the hyperscalers. And there was a specific reason why this happened in the last 3 years. Has Ukraine impacted digital policy? I would say yes. I mean, and it's extremely interesting how those exogenous crises that I mentioned before have a very significant digital policy impact. I mean, for COVID-19, this is self-evident because we needed to make very specific choices with regards to how we would be vaccinating citizens or how we would be digitizing government or the extent to which we would be focusing on the virus. For Ukraine, it's less evident. But for Ukraine, I think that there is a cyber lesson to be made because Ukraine had faced significant cybersecurity threats from Russia in the past, even before this invasion. And the way those attacks happened are a lesson to us all. Second, there is a cloud lesson. There is a lesson about data storage, because overall, and I guess this is why you're asking the question, given your former AWS capacity. But the GDPR mandates that data is stored on EU grounds. Now, Estonia has a data embassy in Luxembourg, if I'm not mistaken. For all of us, we have a bias for data residency domestically in all our countries. And I fully understand and respect this bias, and to a certain extent, it's something that we have opted for domestically as well. But given what has happened in Ukraine, I think all of us need to sit together, all the member states of the EU certainly, and try to understand how what's happening in Ukraine is affecting our data privacy priorities given the location of where we store data. And finally, I think that my Ukrainian colleague is doing a phenomenal job vis-a-vis digitizing services in hours. Ukrainians digitize their passports, and this is something which, at the European Union level, we actually, Greeks have a digital wallet app for their IDs and for their driver's licenses right now. We will quite soon change our physical ID documents too. But what's happening in Ukraine is a signal at the EU level as well, in order to integrate our passports on that wallet and be able to travel with our IDs and internationally using a simple app. Ukrainians are relocating on the basis of their data that they managed to gather on their mobile phones, again, in days. So this is a lesson about nimbleness and speed. And it's a lesson about increasing capacity to deliver digital services. Because, there was a very strong exogenous shock, a physical invasion, which made Ukrainians change the way they were offering certain digital public services. But other countries are saying that they can't deliver those services in years. And the Ukrainians delivered them in days or in weeks. So is there a lesson to be drawn from that? Absolutely.
Thank you. Other questions for the minister?
Yeah, I have a question that goes back to your first point about anticipating problems in addition to solving them. You mentioned your set of, I guess undetermined at this point, problems that you have to fix. How much of the time are you using to look at the technology landscape as well and bring in new technologies as they arise for whatever purpose they might be useful? I'm thinking particularly about Web3 technologies right now, where over the past couple of years before things crashed recently, people had said this would be a new way to do government. Were you scanning that horizon of technology and seeing what you could bring in addition to just solving existing problems?
Yes, but and let me say why. I'm more to Elizabeth's original point that this is not about technology, because I sort of divide advice on the basis of who comes in and says, here's a societal problem that we need to address, versus what will you do with blockchain? I don't care. Seriously, this will be an outcome of the answer to the first question, potentially or potentially not. Technology doesn't drive the answer. It can be a part of the answer if it's optimally suited to provide it. But, a very cynical answer that I used to say to people in Athens when they were asking me, what are you going to do about AI? The cynical answer was, I'm first seeking to achieve pure, and then I will integrate my team and I, the first element. Pure intelligent systems. If you have systems that don't interoperate and don't speak to each other, you need to think of those technologies, yes, but they shouldn't drive the discussion. That's my point. Now, having said this, our job as people who run public organizations is to create the landscape. So we, as a government, integrated a regulatory approach for emerging technologies last summer. Member states of the EU typically have a seat at the table, and most of those things are discussed, debated, and decided upon at the EU level, and you then transpose that to your national legislation. And this is why at the EU we have the Artificial Intelligence Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Governance Act, etc., and previously the GDPR. But you can do many things over and above. You can still have regulatory and legal innovations. AWS invested in Greece, together with Microsoft and Google, because in the context of EU law, we decided to develop a policy called the Cloud First policy. And this is an interesting story, so I will very briefly say it. We knew that the hyperscalers were making decisions on where they would locate their data centers in Southeastern Europe. But Southeastern Europe is not one country, it's many countries. So we wanted to be that country where they would be investing. And at the beginning of that discussion, Greece was in the 301 list of the US Secretary of Trade. Now, I don't know who in this room knows what the 301 list of the US Department of Trade is, but it's a list that includes Iran and North Korea. And it's basically a list which says that you haven't paid for software licenses in your public service. So we figured, okay, this is the first thing that we need to solve when we got into office. And we solved that in 4 months. And then we figured, okay, let's leapfrog. So we sat down for discussions with the hyperscalers. In the context, again, of the GDPR and the EU law on the cloud, we figured, okay, is there something which would trigger you to be interested in Greece? And we reverse engineered what they were telling us. We basically rendered our public sector the #1 client of the hyperscalers by saying that we opt for cloud first, public cloud first. This was signal enough, so all three invested in Greece. What we should be doing for the emerging technologies, as you suggest, in my view, is to create a similar landscape. So we passed a law last summer, which takes into account what the EU will regulate on AI. But for instance, it says that any company in Greece making labor decisions on the basis of AI shall publish the algorithms and shall notify everyone affected that this is an AI algorithm making the decision. We're integrating the usage of drones in our health system and in our postal system and delivering packages. We have regulated and legislated smart contracts. Now, are smart contracts implemented in Greece as we speak? No. But I think that they will quite soon be, because we're creating the landscape. I don't believe that the role of the politician or the role of the minister is to define the specific market need and go in and say, this is what we should be doing. It's to create a landscape where other people, the inventor, the innovator, the business person, will make those decisions.
Let me jump in on that because I think that's a really interesting point you're making. It seems to me that what you're talking about, and I appreciate that you're focusing on solving the problem, and if technology is the solution, so be it. It seems to me that if that's the case, then your next goal is not what percentage of services are online, which is how you described it, but why do we have so many individual services? So if we look at Estonia or other countries where technology was kind of, the infrastructure has been built for all the reasons that we can talk about, the principle of saying the citizen only gives the data once to the government and then it's the government's job and it's the government's burden to figure it out between ministries, that really cuts down on the number of services. So can we expect that Greece would be moving in that direction where it's not just moving things online or moving things to cloud, but actually changing the nature of the services themselves?
This is what we are trying to do. The number that I mentioned before is not the number of the steps, but the number of the life events. The number of the life events is more or less the same, country to country. There are differences, but the number of the services is the same. What is not the same, how bureaucratic you are, is the number of the steps in each one of those events. So if we're digitizing bureaucracy, then effectively we're digitizing exactly what we have right now, on the books of law. But we're not doing that. I mean, I mentioned the birth of a child example before. Creating your business typically was a 5-step event in Greece. Now it's a single-step event through the platform. On other things, though, we haven't yet managed to do that. But if you look at this 1.2 billion transactions that I mentioned before, and you dissect it, half of it is not direct logins where citizens logged in themselves to do something specific. Half of it involves calls in the interoperability center. Estonia has a system called X-Road. We have something equivalent. And by each one of those calls is also a physical visit not made, because it's citizens giving their consent for access to data that the state already has so that the service is fulfilled. Now, it shouldn't be half. It should be 95%. So your comment is absolutely spot on. But we are in the process of changing that too. And as we're changing and making services simpler, the way to do that is to systematically map them. What I cannot map, I cannot reform. What I cannot measure, I cannot reform. So we're measuring ourselves. And I remember that the number in the city of Boston is a bit more than 500 services. The number that we have for a country like Greece, which involves the services that each one of the cities offers, is around 5,500. And those are the external services. We then need to map the internal ones, which is even higher. That's what I expect to find.
Thank you. I saw a hand in the back.
Thank you so much, Minister. I had a quick question that kind of has to do with other countries learning from Greece's model, given all of the progress and reform that you all have made. From a very tactical standpoint, how do you recommend going about identifying some of the pain points that could be solved by digitization? Because is most of it coming from, government officials recognizing the needs in the community and potentially speaking towards those, or is it coming from outreach to communities themselves and getting them to articulate what are the most challenging components that they see in their day-to-day lives?
My claim would be actually that there is no one-size-fits-all approach that could be directly mentioned as a perfect answer here. I think that I think that we have a compass. We don't have a map. The compass is Estonia. So we all need to reach that level. But the way in which we will reach that level, the way in which we will reach our north, is different country to country, state to state, city to city. It depends. The needs are different. Some are fundamentally the same. I mean, changing the processes and mapping them and have a citizen-centric service design, as we would technically describe it, is similar country to country. But the way in which you will deliver that change, do you need a centralized system like we opted for, or should you pick something which is more decentralized because you have talent located at many places and that wouldn't work in the manner in which it did in our case? I think that it's up for the other countries to make that decision. It's up for the Italians to make the Italian decision, and the people of Spain to make the decision for Spain. But the north is Estonia, if I were to say.
It seems to me that in answering that excellent question, you've been speaking a lot about service design and design thinking, and you talked about engineers and systems thinking. And it occurs to me that these are all kind of new careers and new jobs that potentially didn't exist when we were doing our bachelor's degrees. Now governments are hiring people who have design thinking backgrounds, who have computer science backgrounds, who have engineering backgrounds, but also to your question, people who have anthropology degrees and who have expertise in community engagement and are thinking about inequity and systems thinking in a different way. And so I'd be curious to hear from you, Minister, what are, hypothetically speaking, if you were speaking to an audience of students, what are the kinds of skills or training that you think would be required to be successful in the government that you are envisioning in the future?
That's $1 million question. And I'm not sure I have the perfect answer for this question. But in what we were attempting to do, we needed people who had various skills. Some skills are in terms of the education that they have received directly, meaning people who know laws that touch upon technology, data protection. So you need experts on law. Before I speak about the soft skills that are needed, which are even more significant actually, you need experts on law. You need experts on the way government is designed, so political sciences, but actually not even political science, the tacit knowledge of how your government works, on the ground, not theoretically. Third, you need experts who have studied other places and who know how other case studies internationally, this varieties of capitalism approach, as we are at the Center for European Studies, works in the digital sphere, in the digital policy sphere. You need public interest technologists too. I wouldn't say that you need coders in the room per se. You obviously do, but you need coders to implement something. But with regards to the design of the digital service, you need people who understand what we call UI, UX, the user experience, effectively. How technology can fit the specific policy together with the other experts. But then you have a spectrum of soft skills that are needed. People who know negotiations, because we had to negotiate with other departments of government to do what we wanted to do. You need people who understand leadership, motivation, the psychological parameters of reforms. Teams that deliver policy change are very ad hoc. It depends on the mission that you're trying to solve for, that you're trying to achieve. But overall, if I were to think in terms of skills, the broad outline of what I would have in mind is the fact that educational systems are changing all over the world. Because if I think of the discussions we had as children at the family table, it was all about the bachelor's degree. In our generation, it was all about the master's degree. In the generation of my children, aged 7, 5.5, and 5.5, I have 3, It will be about continuous skills enrichment. It will be about reskilling themselves throughout their careers because of two forces. The first force being technological acceleration, and the second force being demographic change, because life expectancy is increasing, with a COVID parenthesis, life expectancy is increasing by 1 year every 4 years. And a child born in countries like the United States right now has a more than 50% chance, if this linear model continues, of reaching up to 100. I hope my children are lucky enough to do that. But if you live up to 100, the three-phase life of education, work, and pension is over. You will have more than one career in your life, and you will need to continuously enrich your skills. So you will have some fundamental skills at the beginning, and for policymakers, the fundamental challenge is to design an educational system that prepares you for jobs that don't yet exist. I mean, you can imagine that this is extremely difficult, and this is why this question is being asked. And this is why I will conclude this very long answer to your short question with the notion that the soft skills are even more important, because I don't see ChatGPT disrupting them.
Big prediction there. We don't know. Let's wait until next week.
Yeah, I mean, sorry. Actually, to be funny, there was an interview that I gave at the Greek press 2 weeks ago at Tanea, a Greek newspaper, where they asked the same questions from me and from ChatGPT, and the kind journalist said, "Oh, Pierakakis is more sophisticated than the algorithm." When I read the answers of the algorithm, I was shocked. So I'm worried myself. But having said this, certain things, I guess, many things will be disrupted, but certain things will never be.
One thing that has become clear, at least for my team and my lab, is when we're hiring scientists to work with governments to do these types of reforms that the minister is talking about, the main thing we are now hiring for is, can you speak government? Not, can you run a regression? And that's
Yes.
kind of a big shift in how we're even thinking about these issues. Other questions for the minister? I see a few hands, so let's go to the front and then we'll go to the back.
Thank you, Minister. This is Elena from Italy, and I was wondering how you are implementing the strategy, the digital Bible, in a socioeconomic and territorial divided context, and Athens versus smaller towns, or rural versus urban, and older people versus young people.
So the Digital Transformation Bible is the quite audaciously named strategy of digital transformation. And it's an interesting document because it's not only a strategic document, it's an implementation plan. It's an implementation plan because it codifies 448 specific projects to be done by 2025. It's not the whole universe of implementation, but for the first time we're saying those are the 448 things we're doing by 2025, and we have budget appropriated to do them. Having said this, had the RRF not existed, the post-COVID reconstruction funds of the EU, which is effectively a Marshall Plan for our era, especially for Greece, we wouldn't have been able to finance this strategy. We would have needed to have made quite difficult choices between purely essential systems. Now we're funding the full scope of what's essential, and we're also funding projects that are very forward-looking, like 5G corridors and AI projects. Now, this question about the divide that you mentioned, I understand that this is very much the debate in Italy between the North and the South. In our case, I would say that the understanding is that most of those systems are horizontal, and we're trying to cover 100% of the country with fiber optics. We are covering almost the full country with 5G networks. All of those systems are centralized, meaning that they're offered through gov.gr. But if you look at who is to benefit, my claim would be that the regions are benefiting even more with this service provision. And what we're doing with regards to smart cities is actually that we have a funding mechanism for all 332 cities in Greece to actually finance their digital ambitions, which is done in a collaboration with us. We didn't go to one extreme of saying that this is what you're doing, or to the other extreme of letting things completely loose. We went in the middle road. And the middle road was that we had a menu of choices, and each region, each city could come to us and say that out of this menu, this is what I'm picking, and this is how it fits my local strategy. And we figured that this policy approach was optimal for Greece. And Italy, as my colleague who used to be the Minister of Italy, of the Italian government for digital up until recently, Vittorio Colao, my understanding is that this was the policy approach that he opted for as well.
We had a hand in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. Some of these services, I live in Sweden, have sounded very familiar. Getting the kind of COVID vaccine updates on your phone immediately after taking the first, for example. Very, very nice. I'm wondering, like, speaking of Estonia, you're talking about, as you know, voting turnout is fairly low in Greece, and I'm wondering if you've thought about having online voting as a service through sort of digital means, and if this is something you've discussed, and what you might expect to get out of this as a service.
I would very bluntly say that you do this last.
And the reason is trust. Because you need to have we integrated online voting? Yes, we have, for unions, for universities, in their internal voting. We're doing that, and we have a very secure system, which is called Zeus. We have a very successful system. It was actually used by a political party in Romania to do their online, their primaries. But you do this last for the Jenga reason. You first need to have established trust towards the digital system, and after you have built this full edifice, then you potentially integrate online voting. My expectation is that all countries will at some point integrate this. But, we will need to answer certain questions. How do you recount in the online voting? I mean, I trust the algorithm, but you need to have visibility of the recount and acceptance of the recount amongst all the political stakeholders. I think that we need a bit more experience with digital in order to be able to make that claim that we're integrating such a system in our national politics.
Some countries are struggling with just regular recounts.
Yes. And Estonia is the only country doing it, by the way, so far, right? You haven't integrated it in Sweden yet, or in Finland.
We're talking about it for municipal elections, but I mean, not national.
I want to do a quick time check. We have until 4:15, right, Elaine? Okay, great. So let's take some more questions for the minister.
I have a question. So, Mr. Minister, Kyriakos, thank you so much for being here today. Your indefatigable energy, dynamism, and enthusiasm for what you're doing in Greece is really infectious. And I'm really happy that you're here sharing your time and your experience, especially with our students, especially in this era where inspiring students to go into public service gets harder and harder, especially in the US. So when you think about your time as a student at the Kennedy School, and you think back to the choices that you were making about what you were studying, what you would do afterward, what advice would you give to your 22-year-old self if you could go back in time? What do you know now that you wish you knew then?
Elaine, you stole my last question.
Great minds.
Please go ahead.
We will have to turn off the camera. I'm kidding. No, that's a great question, and this is something that I kept thinking actually since Saturday when I arrived. It's an extrapolation of something I previously said. Back at the time I was 22 years old when I came to the Kennedy School, and 24 when I went to MIT. I was focusing a lot on, rigorous classes. I wanted to do as many classes in economics as possible, for instance. Now, my 39-year-old self would tell the younger me, take more classes on soft skills, do more classes on leadership, do more classes on, organization of teams, community organizing, etc. Things that I understand now are extremely important and interesting on the ground. Back at the time, I felt that I wanted to focus more on the technical elements. Perhaps, of course, this answer is a fallacy that I'm saying that because of the technical training that I received back then. But this is at least what I feel, today, Tuesday, being here at Harvard.
It is definitely true that what smart people do has shifted. So in public policy, policy design was the main focus for a lot of people. And I really appreciate that you have focused on implementation, because I think that's also a shift where more and more smart people at the Kennedy School and beyond are saying, okay, as you said, lots of good ideas in the world. The science of implementation, the science of bringing along a community for major reform, needs as much attention as the big design questions.
If I may add an element to the answer, though, the best class I took while at the Kennedy School, which I still remember, was API 302, the class of Richard Zackhauser, Analytic Frameworks for Policy, which had that philosophy at its nucleus.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
Thank you, Minister, for your remarks. I'm wondering, as Greece moves into this more digital, private, and public partnerships and sectors, and I know this is not in the jurisdiction of your ministry exactly, but how are you thinking about digital literacy when it comes to education? I think that using the services as well as trust, as you said, trusting the algorithm for voting, comes to whether a person understands how algorithms work, how technology works. So how are you thinking about your ministry collaborating possibly with Ministry of Education to create a better educational framework for digital literacy for younger kids?
There are many elements of digital literacy that we need to focus on, and digital skills that we need to focus on.
The most pertinent ones right now on the ground are actually how do we integrate systems for those who don't have digital skills at all. And if you think of digital skills, it's one of the 4 dimensions of digital. I mean, typically when we think of digital and we assess ourselves, we have 4 dimensions: digital public services, telecommunications, penetration of digital in the private economy, and skills. Vis-a-vis skills, we're trying to do many things at once before answering exactly what you asked. The first thing is design specific projects for people who are not savvy digitally at all. And there the training can only be physical, can only be face-to-face. So for instance, we're going to have a project at the citizen service centers, which we have 1,000 of in Greece, located throughout the land, where people who come in for a specific service, they will be notified by someone at the citizen service center telling them, you could have done this online, let me show you how. So that's one thing, let's say. But what you generally need to do is that you need to have multiple service design pathways. So you need to have a digital and a physical equivalent. So gov.gr will be the digital, the citizen service centers will be the one that you will be doing with physical presence. Now, digital skills, this is one element. The second element is how do we retrain people who are within the public service, or how do we train them from scratch on digital services and digital systems? And there we need to produce certifications and finance certifications. I mean, for instance, people at my ministry, they are extremely good at handling in-premise cloud capabilities. We would love to help them and enable them to learn how to use the public cloud, be it Microsoft's Azure, AWS, or Google's cloud. So this is the second thing that we plan to do. The third is to think out of the box. Out of the box thinking, for instance, requires you sometimes to think of the past. Again, family discussions at the Sunday table. I remember in the post-World War II Greece, our grandparents discussing how they had a specific skill that they learned, which was certified from the army, from their army service. We lost that in the process. So a project that we're currently designing is, through the context of the mandatory army service that we will be doing in Greece, to have a specific skill that will be certified, primarily digital skills, which will be offered to all individuals that are doing their service. Fourth element is how do you reskill those we're looking for people who know coding, but we don't have enough. Greek technological companies are seeking for coders. So how do you find coders? One obvious choice, the low-hanging fruit, is try to attract people who left during the years of economic hardship and bring them back. This is happening to an extent. But we also need to retrain others. So unemployed STEM graduates are the low-hanging fruit of digital reskilling. So we will target programs for them. And finally, to eventually reach the core point of your question, we need to also change the way we're teaching digital throughout our educational system. But generally speaking, children that are the age of my children are digital natives. Honestly, they teach me how to do certain things. So primarily, we would need to teach them the cultural elements of digital, I think, rather than the technical elements. So the obvious example here is that when they ask us about cybersecurity, Greeks learn the story of the Trojan horse quite early on in the whole world. So you can have the perfect walls created, and then a cultural decision can completely destroy your strategy, bringing the Trojan horse in. So, we can have the perfect digital system, but if the wrong public servant plugs the wrong USB on the wrong computer at the wrong time, the whole system might collapse. So it's primarily that culture, the culture of sharing data on social media, the culture of what you share generally with others vis-a-vis your data. Those types of things shall be better integrated rather than learning Python. Algorithmic thinking, yes. Python, Ruby, excellent, but I learned Fortran on my first year of computer science. We called it the archaeology class.
Thank you so much, Minister. We're almost out of time, so given that Elaine asked the question that I wanted to ask the Minister as a last question about advice looking backwards, let me ask you a final question looking forward. And I'll invite you to share as much as you would like. If we look at kind of what you've accomplished over the past 20 years of your career or so, you've really taken on big challenges around youth entrepreneurship, now around a huge digital leap for Greece. If you could kind of look forward, let's say in 20 years, to not make it relevant to the current situation, what's the thing that's going to keep you up at night, the next big thing that you want to be tackling, given your skills and your leadership?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, because primarily, typically, if one would ask me, what's the thing that keeps you up at night? The typical response that I try to give is what I don't know. Meaning, how do you create a system that anticipates the unknown? And that's the most difficult of all things to answer, because in reality, we have exogenous crises that, I mean, obviously, I'm a member of the Kyriakos Mitsotakis government, so I can attest to the capabilities of the Prime Minister in handling those crises that we had to handle in the last 3.5 years. But generally speaking, we need to create systems. When we have a crisis at the ministry, it reaches my level very quickly. Ideally, it shouldn't. When you have an issue with any system, ideally the issue should resolve itself before it reaches the ministerial level or even the political level. That we haven't achieved. So my overall, I would say, aspiration would be to create an overall bureaucratic and state system in Greece, be that for education policy, energy policy, IT policy, or whatever, that can handle a crisis automatically to a certain extent, that has the culture, the agility, and the anti-fragility, to use a term, to be able to handle crises in a robust manner. And that we haven't achieved yet. We're handling them, but we're handling them really well at the top level. We need to handle them at the bottom of the pyramid better. And we can. And I'm extremely optimistic that we will be able to do it.
Well, on that very optimistic note, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today. Please join me in thanking the Minister for his time.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing what's next.
Likewise.